Greetings, everyone. James Furman here. For those of you that don't know me, I'm the U.S. Forest Service DoD liaison. And prior to taking this job with the regional office in Region 9, I served for 15 years as the Wildland Fire Program Manager at Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And the research project and the results of this research project that I'm about to go over with you, I think you'll find very interesting. And it began when I was still at Eglin Air Force Base back in 2012, 2013. And it was about a 5.5 year project to bring it to completion. But at Eglin, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, very large prescribed fire program, actually averaged over 100,000 acres per year of prescribed fire, as well as running about 100 wildfires per year. So it's real busy. And as the Wildland Fire Program Manager there, that position is something like a cross between an FMO and a line officer as far as how DoD is set up. But with that, going to be going over a research project and some of the results that I got out of that, and I think you'll find it very interesting. Certainly looking forward to sharing this with everyone as we go through. And my contact information will be at the end if anybody has any questions that they want to follow up with. So, problem statement, what we were looking at when we started developing this project, that large-scale prescribed fires utilize an interaction between fire and the atmosphere. As burn bosses, you have to look at wind speeds and that sort of thing, obviously, but how you ignite an area also impacts how it will burn. There's this interaction that takes place, and current operational fire models, Behave Plus, Farsight, etc., simply, were not designed to account for these types of complex interactions. And without models that can take into account these kinds of fire atmospheric interactions, you simply can't get the level of detail for predicted fire behavior that would be useful. For example, the infrared pictures at the bottom of the screen here. The picture in the lower left-hand corner shows a couple of fire lines, and just a couple of minutes later, it shows those same two fire lines as they start to interact. And this is the kind of thing that Farsight and Behave Plus simply are not capable of capturing, but that become very important for prescribed fire managers, burn bosses, firing bosses, etc. So we put together and got funded for a project. It was actually funded by the DoD research branch called ESTCP. DoD is certainly acronym rich. ESTCP is their Environmental Security Technology Certification Program. And we looked at using fire tech, and we'll talk more about that shortly. Use fire tech to simulate fire behavior for specific prescribed fire scenarios. So using fire tech, we looked at different fuel structure, ignition techniques, wind speeds, and we developed and modeled scenarios based on practitioners, i.e. mine and my staff's real world questions with regard to how fire interacts with different firing techniques, etc. So got real excited when I saw what fire tech can do with regard to disseminating results to prescribed fire practitioners, because it can generate, as you'll see, some amazing training tools or visuals. So I looked at what it could do and thought, if I can prevent others from having to learn from the same mistakes that I made when I was cutting my teeth as a burn boss, that would be a good thing. And so, we dived into this project. Actually, got funding in 2013, and it was about a 5.5 year project by the time we wrapped it up. So what exactly is fire tech? Fire tech is a physics-based fire model. It takes into account a number of different things. It looks at not only your ambient wind, but it looks at turbulence, it looks at fire-induced turbulence, it looks at the effect of vegetation drag, heat transfer, fuel consumption, energy release. The animation that you see at the lower right shows other things that fire tech's been used for. This is particular use was what would happen if the shuttle blew up at Cape Canaveral. Where would the poisonous gas cloud go if you had easterly winds? And so very sophisticated model, actually uses a 3D fuel grid. So every bit of the area that you are modeling, you have to have complete three-dimensional fuel information, including bulk density, fuel loading, fuel moisture, etc. So very computationally intense. It was developed at Los Alamos Lab and actually runs on the supercomputer at Los Alamos Lab or other supercomputers. So this was actually the first simulation that I saw with fire tech that got me excited about this project, and just a couple of different ways that it can display, and I'll show you some others as we go through it. But so here we have a backing fire backing into the wind, and you'll soon see a head fire set on the upwind side and be able to see how that head fire impacts the backing fire. So it captures the interaction between these fire lines. So you can almost immediately see that the backing fire picks up intensity once the head fire is lit, and they start drawing together as the backing fire blocks the ambient wind from the backing fire. So I saw this, and it just looked so much like converging fire lines at Eglin when we were working there, that I thought, what a great opportunity, especially for new folks coming into the prescribed fire world. Let's do some scenarios that are a bit more involved in this, using some real world fuels from Eglin Air Force Base. So current fire models, your Farsight and FS Pro and those oversimplify the way that fire spreads, simply because they're not physics-based models. In this particular visual, what you're looking at is the wind blowing towards you, and a line of fire has been set, and these wavy lines that you see represent a vertical slice of atmosphere, and it represents the turbulence that's being that's evolving as this line of fire comes towards you. You can see some roll vortices forming, and as the fire gets closer, atmosphere gets more disturbed, and this is just to demonstrate the level of detail that's generated by fire tech, what it's capable of with regard to modeling fire behavior at a very fine scale. So fire tech was used early on when it was first developed in the International Crown Fire modeling experiments up in British Columbia. And you can see in the lower right hand side the actual picture, and to the left a picture of the simulation, and also the short movie clip that you're seeing running. That's the actual fire tech simulation of this Crown Fire modeling experiment. So a lot of inputs go in, but the output and the level of detail is pretty amazing. And as mentioned earlier, fire tech can display things a number of different ways. This is the top view of the Crown Fire modeling experiments. You can see the fire that's being lit on the upwind side, and you can see the wind vectors. And notice in the fire breaks, where they've cleared the fire breaks, how it channels the wind, even to the point that it's you know, drawing the wind back towards the fire against the ambient wind direction. So it's kind of interesting. Fire tech kind of exposed some of the flaws in the design for this experiment because the fire breaks were so wide and so cleared that they actually impacted the way that the crown fire spread. So just a demonstration of what fire tech is capable of. So shifting to prescribed fire scenarios, let's just look at a hypothetical here. So you're the burn boss. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you're halfway through igniting a 1,700 acre aerial ignition burn, flying perpendicular to the wind, igniting approximately 4 fires per acre. So, PSD machine, you're setting about 4 fires per acre. It's early April, 72 degrees, humidity is 40%, winds 8 miles an hour. The forecast dispersion index is 40 for the day, but it's a 1 for the evening, meaning very poor dispersion in the evening. Fire intensity is getting higher than desired, particularly in the center of the ignited area. There's no way to shut down the burn. You're committed at this point. There are no cutoff points, so you've got to finish the burn, but you want to moderate fire intensity. So how would you moderate fire intensity? Should you increase the density of ignitions, or should you decrease the density of ignitions, or don't know? Well, the unfortunate truth is that there are a lot of opinions on what you should do, but really the correct answer is C. At least up to this point, we truly don't know the best way to minimize canopy damage in a scenario like this. So these are the kinds of things that we wanted to get at when we designed this project. It was literally me and my prescribed fire program manager and my fire ecologist sitting down at a table with Dr. Rod Lynn, the developer of FireTech from the Los Alamos National Lab. And we specifically designed this project to address the real world questions that we as managers had, while also rigorously testing FireTech to see, how well it captured the things that we did know, kind of as a way to evaluate the model itself. And so we looked at 2 different wind speeds, 5 miles per hour and 12 miles per hour, because particularly in the longleaf pine forest where these scenarios were developed, that's kind of the lower end and the upper end within which most prescribed fires take place. We looked at dormant versus growing season by changing leaf on versus leaf off, as well as your live fuel moistures. We looked at open stands versus mid-story stand conditions, looked at a number of different firing patterns. We won't be able to go through all of these today. I'm just going to hit some highlights, but looked at stripped head. We looked at closed versus open flanks, different dash ignitions, point source ignition, inline versus staggered, varying the density of ignition points. And another burning question, as I mentioned earlier, how do we quickly train proficient fire managers? And most importantly, how can we more effectively meet prescribed fire objectives? So early on, started running some scenarios, and these are just screen captures showing what FireTech produced under 5 mile per hour winds in the top row and 12 mile an hour winds in the bottom row, captured at the same time under grass conditions on the left, then canopy conditions, where essentially we put the trees in there but with no mid-story, and then canopy with mid-story for the rest, and then varying the number of lines. And FireTech, right off the bat, you pass the sniff test as far as, yeah, it's going to spread faster in 12 miles an hour winds. It's going to spread faster in an open grassy field as compared to canopy, and it's the slowest spread, but the higher intensity is going to be when you've got canopy with mid-stories. So, early sniff test pass with flying colors. And so here is what we'll be looking at. Uh, the entire area shown, with trees is 75 acres. There'll be 41 acres ignited. We actively fired with using ATVs at Eglin, and you can see 5 ATVs simulated, moving through the stand. You can see interactions between the fire lines. We had the ATVs moving at 7.5 miles an hour, and the typical kind of the baseline was a mid-story component, 150 feet between the igniters. This particular scenario is the 5 miles per hour, and in these scenarios, looked at 80 degrees temp, 3.5 tons per acre fuel loading, and you can see the fine dead fuel moistures for your grass and your mid-story. And we'll look at some of these more closely and some comparisons of some of the different runs that we did in this project. So this one in particular, we're going to be comparing 14-meter dash ignition with strips between and strip ignition like we saw before, but this is with 12 mile per hour winds. So you can see the dash ignitions on the left and the strip head fire on the right under 12 mile per hour winds. And under the 12 mile per hour winds with the strip head fire, you can see you're generating some pretty serious fire intensity. And after the fires pass through, particularly on the right, the areas that show as black represent canopy consumption by the fire as it moved through. If you look at the dash ignition on the left, where you've got the opportunity for fresh air to come in and cool things down, you have a much lower amount of canopy consumption. So again, kind of past the sniff test, and also showing higher intensity overall with 12 mile per hour winds as compared to the 5 mile an hour winds we saw in the previous slide. So of course it can also generate numbers that you can plug into the spreadsheets and generate graphs, and that's what we did for this particular project. But rules of thumb are important to fire managers, and in this case, FireTech really did a good job of evaluating or verifying the rules of thumb that we're familiar with. Again, in general, higher winds produce greater consumption for all the ignition scenarios. In general, aerial or point source ignition produced lower overall consumption than ground or ATV ignition, particularly with solid lines of fire, and higher numbers of simultaneous ignition strips generally produced higher consumption, canopy and mid-story consumption. So you can see the differences where the top bars are aerial ignition showing lower consumption overall. The bottom bars are different the ATV strip head fire ignitions under 12 mile an hour and 5 mile an hour winds. And so definitely, once again, pass the sniff test for what we would expect under those conditions. One of the other things that we looked at was differences in fuel loadings. And in this comparison, left and right, we're showing our standard. On the left, you've got the 3.5 tons per acre that we talked about as our kind of baseline conditions. And on the right-hand side, we increased the bulk density or fuel loading by 30%. And you can see much more pronounced canopy consumption on the right-hand side, which again makes sense. But this was one of the things that I really wanted to be able to illustrate under light wind conditions and heavy fuel loadings. What can often happen is what came to be known, at least at Eglin, we called it the donut hole of death. That's what happened when winds were too light and you fired too aggressively, especially under heavy fuel loadings. Fire draws to the middle and blows the canopy out. So a nice illustration of that. Now, here we're going to be comparing ATV strip head fire 5 lines with aerial ignition, and this is a view from upwind. So the ATV ignition is above. You can actually see, the plume that's starting to develop as the ATVs work through the block. And of course, this is sped up from real time. We wouldn't have time to watch the entire 41 acres being burned. And on the bottom, you can see much slower and more dispersed smoke being put up from the aerial ignition, because of course helicopters flying back and forth in drifts and point source ignition. So a really nice way of illustrating number one, the value of rapid ignition as far as getting your smoke up and out, but also trade-off being strip head fire ignition, rapid ignition, a higher degree of canopy consumption as compared to your point source ignition. So you can see the point source ignition, even though they were begun at the same time, still takes a while to burn out after the ATV ignition is completed. So we can look at this another way. We've removed the trees and turned this sideways. So you're looking at a side view of the same thing, and we've color coded the plume where your redder colors are your updrafts and your bluer colors are downdrafts. So it makes it really nice. You'll be able to see as things get started, especially on the ATV ignition, you'll be able to really see some vortices, some rolling of the smoke plume as it gets going. You can see the 5 ATVs have entered the block. You can see the helicopter pulling its drifts back and forth, setting fire. You can really see the turbulence in that rapid ignition from the ATV ignition. So again, I thought that this is just a great way to train folks that are learning about prescribed fire ignition techniques and smoke management in particular, some of the benefits and trade-offs of these different firing techniques. So some pretty amazing visuals, and again, just really matches my experience with prescribed fire in the fuels that we had at Eglin Air Force Base. Though I might also add that even though this is longleaf pine forest and fuels, I truly believe that many of the principles would transfer well to other fuels. And I'd also add that fire tech and some of the other newer physics-based models are being used to model fuels in the Northeast. There's a lot of great work being done by Nick Skronsky and the crew in the Jersey Pine Barrens. So there is work being done in other fuel models, and fire tech has also been used to model scenarios for various wildfires, recreating and studying tragedy events and that sort of thing. So it's been used in a lot of different fuel types. So this is actually one of my favorite visualizations. This is a top view, 5 ATV ignition. And again, blue is downdrafts and red represents updrafts. And you can see the ATVs are entering And notice how the winds and the downdrafts start increasing as the fire is burning. Of course, air has to move into cover. I just want to stop it here for a second, let you look at where this, I guess this convective core has developed, where these fire lines are pulled together. And look what it's done to your uh, backing fire. Your downwind fire line is being pulled into that core. And you can see it very well in both the illustration that looks like fire as well as the one that shows the wind vectors. So, a great way to illustrate the importance of paying attention. And when I'm talking with folks about this particular scenario, I also mention application. If you're teaching somebody about how to set counter fire for a wildfire, oftentimes the best time to do that is when all of a sudden, when you're facing into the prevailing wind and the wildfire is coming towards you, when the wind all of a sudden switches and hits you at the back, is a good time to set that counter fire. But it's also kind of a watch out situation if you are prescribed burning, because that means that it's going to be drawing in and you're going to have potential canopy consumption on the interior of your burn, particularly if canopy consumption is not one of your objectives of your fire. If you're wanting to do stand replacement burns, that might be exactly what you want. So anyway, a couple of really interesting ways to display, and once again, you can see as it's passed through, you can see the canopy consumption where those fire lines pull together. So just another way that fire tech can display information, and this is looking at it from the side. You can see the ATVs moving in. You're actually viewing it from downwind, and it's showing through a vertical slice of atmosphere. And it's just a neat way to look at plume lift and vortices and that sort of thing as generated by fire tech. So you can see that convective core following those ATVs, from the left towards the right, where those converging fire lines pull together. And we did some comparisons of the aerial ignition by increasing ignition points. We varied between 3 per acre versus 6 per acre on ignition points. And what we found, at least from fire tech, differences were subtle overall, and differences in the 12-mile-an-hour scenario was hardly notable between inline versus staggered. Uh, just very little difference. The higher wind speed was definitely the dominant factor in how the fire behaved. With 5-mile-an-hour winds, we saw more difference, but again, not necessarily statistically valid. So, uh, it doesn't give a definitive answer at this point. But you know, in general, you can see what it's showing. Uh, More research is needed regarding that scenario we talked about earlier, where do you increase or decrease, uh, particularly under the lighter wind scenarios. So still learning. So overall project results, and the one that I was just absolutely thrilled with is I gave a similar presentation to the staff at the National Interagency Prescribed Fire Training Center, and they immediately agreed to adopt some of these visuals into their curriculum for the prescribed fire training, all the folks that go through there. So, hundreds of the burn bosses will be seeing results from this project as part of the training that they get through Interagency Prescribed Fire Training Center. So I was really, really happy about that. Also, as part of the project, we did a number of facilitated workshops at specifically DoD facilities and at Tall Timbers work or Tall Timbers Research Station there in Tallahassee, but did a workshop at Eglin, did a workshop at Tall Timbers, and did a workshop at Fort Stewart in Georgia, which is consistently the most productive prescribed fire program in the country. They average over 120,000 acres of prescribed fire per year. But between these three workshops that we put on, we had some of the most experienced burn bosses, excuse me, in the country. And I did some rough back of the envelope calculations, and the staff represented more than 20 million acres of prescribed fire experience, primarily in Southern fuels, as is being demonstrated in these. And so from these workshops, to the question, general fire phenomenology, or the statement rather, general fire phenomenology in drafts, convection, flaming front, etc., is modeled well by fire tech for the prescribed fire scenarios. Simulated 94% of the attendees, these most experienced burn bosses, agreed or strongly agreed. 97% agreed or strongly agreed, with 61% strongly agreeing that current prescribed fire training could be improved using these visual projects, or the visuals from this project. And 87% agree or strongly agree that the fire tech demonstration improved their understanding of prescribed fire ignition techniques and resulting fire behavior. Again, this is, these are amazingly experienced burn bosses. So taking a glimpse into the future, one of the results from this, because of the wealth of data that was generated from this project, Tall Timbers actually got funding, and they're working with Interagency Prescribed Fire Training Center, which is now located at Tall Timbers Research Station north of Tallahassee. They're looking at three-dimensional training, virtual reality, like putting on the goggles, and the goal, though several years down the road still, I'm sure, will be you get folks into a virtual training scenario with the 3D glasses on, and you set a virtual fire, and if it's burning too hot, the trainee can say, let's switch to point source ignition, and the fire behavior would switch to that modeled by point source ignition. So anyway, real exciting things that have been spin-offs from this particular project. So they say it takes a community or a tribe, and we certainly had that with this particular project. A lot of different players. I'm not going to read them all off to you. You're certainly capable of doing that, but a lot of collaboration between a lot of different organizations, and definitely support from Department of Defense, who provided all of the funding for this project. And with that, any burning questions from the group can be forwarded to me at the email address below or at the telephone. But I hope you found this useful. And again, I've been very excited and really honored to be involved in this project, and have been very pleased with the results. So with that, we'll conclude the presentation.